and welcome. This is the Church Times webinar on AI and the Church, and it is the result of this really fabulous special edition that I'm holding up that I hope you all caught, which was a real great gift to the Church from the Church Times to get us all to engage in this really timely topic. Now, we have a fantastic panel lined up for you tonight. I'm just going to say a little bit about how the evening will go. And we are encouraging you all to put questions in the chat, and it's lovely to see where you're all coming from today to get a sense of the spread of people on this webinar. And welcome to you all, and to those of you who will be watching this at a later date. I should probably say before we start who I am. I'm Eve Poole, and I wrote a book called Robot Souls, which is this book here. And I also wrote one of the pieces in the Church Times special edition. The three panelists I have with me tonight, the first is Bishop Stephen. Bishop Stephen Croft is the Lord Bishop of Oxford, and he's the lead bishop for AI and tech in the House of Lords. And he'll say a little bit more about his involvement in this space when he talks to you later. We also have Professor Dr. Beth Singler, who is Assistant Professor of Digital Religions at the University of Zurich, who will be talking to you a bit about her work. And we have Andrew Brown, who is very well known to the Church Times audience, who is also a founding member of The Independent and wants you all to know that he is still conscious. So we'll come to them in a moment. But first of all, AI, it's one of those jargony things. What do we mean by it? You'll hear us using AI fairly interchangeably tonight to mean a variety of different things. But in general, AI refers to an attempt to copy human intelligence. And sometimes that is about individual intelligence towards something like a chess game or a particular project like protein folding, something like that. There is also something that gets called AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, which is the idea that we might be able to somehow create something a bit like us that can do lots of things simultaneously. It can protein fold, and it can Google, and it can talk, and it can win at chess, and do all these things simultaneously. And the idea is that when that happens, we reach the singularity and AI overtakes us. So you'll find us using as little jargon as possible in this. But if you need a jargon buster, this book of mine, the Robot Souls book, has 20 pages of glossary at the back, which will help you. And certainly the Church Times special edition will also help you catch up on some background. So welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. This is a really important topic, and we're dying to hear what your questions are. But what we'll do first is we'll hear from our fantastic panel. I will then pause and ask them some questions about what I've heard, and they may also want to ask each other some questions, but then it'll be over to you. And we've had some questions already submitted that we'll ask first, and then as we pick them off the chat, we'll refer them out to members of the panel to give you their thoughts on the questions you've posed. So please don't hold back. There's no such thing as a stupid question. We're all learning, and everything is changing so quickly that even by the end of this evening, we'll probably be out of date. So please, no stupid questions at all. Ask anything you like, and we will endeavour to answer collectively. And then at the end, we'll be offering you a Church House Bookshop special deals and discounts on some useful books. And after the webinar, we'll be emailing all of you with some useful resources and links. So I'll say all that again just at the end to remind you. But now, with no further ado, we are going to go to the first of our panelists, Bishop Stephen, who is going to talk for about 5 minutes, don't time him just in case, and tell us a little bit about his perspective on AI. Thank you, Bishop.
Thanks very much, Eve. Good evening, everyone. Really good to be with you and share in this really interesting webinar. I've been trying to learn about artificial intelligence for about the last 7 years. I began the journey because my eldest son, Paul, is a computer games designer and entrepreneur, and fed me things to read over the years, including on AI, and that alerted me to the significant questions that AI brings in terms of what it means to be human and human identity. So I followed that journey of learning through an all-party parliamentary group that I'm part of, which has been going on for 7 years, through a Lord's Select Committee 1-year inquiry on artificial intelligence, through work to have a second 1-year inquiry on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and over the last 2 years, pretty intensively working on the online safety bill, which completed its passage through Parliament just 2 weeks ago. I was also, for 2.5 years, one of the founding board members of the government's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So from each of those experiences, I've learned a bit more, and I guess my focus has been on how to develop good, strong, robust, ethical public policy and governance in the field of artificial intelligence. Eve's given some definitions. It helps me to think in terms of 3 bands, and the challenge of regulation is slightly different in each band. The most important for me is where Eve began, sometimes called narrow artificial intelligence, but the application of a technology which involves a lot of data and algorithms and some machine learning across a very narrow sphere of activity, but often a very important one. So narrow AI is being deployed in medicine quite a lot, most of all in scanning. It's deployed in policing through facial recognition technology and through some predictive policing work. It's employed by some social services, and it's obviously clearly very important that we gain the most good we can from the technology in terms of efficiencies and human machine good working, but also vital that we avoid risks which might be brought by bias or incomplete data or not thinking through the parameters of the technology. Regulation in that sphere of narrow AI is largely retrospective because the technology has developed extremely rapidly with often unforeseen consequences and often driven by large technology companies. And we are learning how to regulate, as it were, in arrears. And that's supremely been the case with the online safety bill, where the advent of big tech and social media has created a very toxic environment in many spheres of life, where young people in particular have been damaged and are being damaged in all kinds of ways. And the online safety bill attempts to set regulation in place, and that's proved a really interesting but challenging thing to do. And I can say more about that as we go through the evening. The second kind of AI is largely new in terms of public consciousness, and that's normally called generative AI, ChatGPT, the large language learning models, which don't just manipulate data. The machines are able to appear to be creative through the manipulation of very large quantities of data and learning on much of the text that's available on the internet. Regulation in that sphere is at the moment largely speculative and prospective. The technology has only just arrived. It's arrived with sufficient alarm bells to make the governments of the world sit up, as well as the leading tech entrepreneurs, and issue warnings about it. It's created alarm about people's creativity and what that will do to our humanity. But the conversation is just beginning about how we might have sensible, wise public policy. And one of the fears is that the technology will move faster than the regulation is able to keep up. Very important principle emerges, therefore, called the precautionary principle, such that we don't move more quickly than we've got good ethics and good regulation. The third area, very briefly, is general AI, the idea that we might develop machines which are multi-competent or even conscious. As far as I can see from the people I talk to, that's a generation away, if ever it will arrive. That for me is not the real risk, though it's often where conversation focuses. The real risks of AI are the use outstripping the public debate. We don't need new ethics for AI. We need to apply the ethics we already have offline to the online world. There are good summaries of AI principles, including the Rome Call on AI ethics. I'll gladly come back to that. And I think the role of civil society and of the church and of the clergy in all of this is very much to raise the public conversation, which is why I'm delighted to be here this evening and really pleased with that Church Times special edition. Eve, back to you.
Thanks, Bishop. Really helpful to know that you're absolutely the heart of all these really difficult conversations. And so much of it, as you say, has had to be retrospective, but there's now this very interesting trying to be precautionary and trying to be speculative about what could happen around generative AI. So again, as you say, conversations like these often throw up things we haven't all thought of that might be useful to feed into those conversations. So do note that Bishop Stephen is your key contact if you have thoughts about any of that to feed into the conversations he is part of. So thank you, Bishop. I know that will also have aroused lots of questions. Do keep those coming in the chat. And now we'll move on to hear from Beth. Beth, tell us what you think about all of this.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. I've been looking at the intersection of religion and technology for about 13 years, both in the field of digital religions, so looking at how people express their religious identity in online and virtual spaces, but also more recently looking at the entanglements of AI and religion. Now, I do this primarily as an anthropologist. That means I'm observing and participating in spaces where people are having these kinds of conversations and where changes are actually affecting people. This doesn't mean necessarily that I'm very good at making predictions. I want to look at the trends as they are now, but a lot of the time the conversation around AI and religion is about the future of religion. So this is something that I touch on, looking at people's ideas of what that might look like and where things are going, knowing that technology has always been a part of the change and transformation of religion. When it comes to artificial intelligence, I usually describe myself as looking at 4 distinct entanglements or areas in which AI and religion intersect. The first of those is how established religions are using and responding to artificial intelligence. So as I say, technology has always been a part of religion. There is a bit of a stereotype sometimes, especially in some areas of AI discourse, that religion is something of the past and AI is something of the future. But all religious organizations are thinking about how they employ AI, sometimes as a user interface for things like prayer apps and forms of ChatGPT that you can have a conversation with and find out information. They're also thinking about how they should respond to the inequality that's coming because of artificial intelligence and automation. Second area that I look at is when people try to formulate their own spirituality around artificial intelligence. So either explicit new religious movements or people within established religions who want to think of AI in a theological way. The third area is around how AI itself is approached implicitly religiously. So when people start using illustrations and narratives and tropes of AI as being godlike, the singularity has already been mentioned. The singularity is this sort of exponential view of artificial intelligence and where it's going. For some people, the language they employ, even if they themselves have no religious belief, in some cases, the language that is employed and the imagery that's employed can often be quite religious. So an example of this would be what I call the AI creation meme, where the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel has been remixed in various different spaces to employ a robot hand or a digital AI hand. And this is sometimes in very overtly secular and business-like spaces. So I'm interested in how the narratives cross between the secular and the sacred. And the final area is in discussions of how, as I said, AI is perceived as a future thing and religion is perceived as a past thing, and discussions of how atheism will be enhanced by artificial intelligence, that actually religion will be left behind in some way. I look at people's accounts of that and what they think is likely to happen. When it comes to established religions and their interactions with AI, I also tend to think of it in 2 ways, that there will be both simulation and stimulation. So simulation refers to when people are using artificial intelligence and generative AI in particular, has been mentioned by the bishop, that people can use large language models or GAN systems to create images and text off of the back of existing corpuses. So people are already using ChatGPT to write sermons, to answer their theological questions. People are developing what are called theomorphic robots that take sort of religious positions and religious status as statues and forms that remind people of religious imagery. And all these elements are sort of a replication of existing religious forms. That's why I use the term simulation. It can sometimes mean a sort of virtual or not quite real version. So people are generating new texts and new references to what Jesus might have said using ChatGPT. It can also provide stimulation, though. So the conversation we're having this evening is an example of how, by using AI, by engaging with this technology and talking about it, people are starting to be increasingly interested in larger philosophical and religious ideas. It's very quick that you see the conversation go to things like, what does it mean to be human in an age of AI? People rush quite fast to the larger existential questions, and sometimes, unfortunately, past the near future, near-term ethical questions. So we'll see both these elements happening with religious engagement with artificial intelligence, both the simulation and the stimulation of religious conversations. And the larger question I sometimes get asked about, what does this mean for the future of religion, with the presumption sometimes, again, that this might lead to the end of religion. I think there's going to likely be a continuation of spiritual and religious ideas around technology, as there have always been throughout history, that we get our inspiration from forms of technology, and conversely, our religious context shapes how we want our technology to work and in which particular ways. So something will continue. There will always be something that we might be called religion, although our language might change. It might be more implicitly religious in people's behaviors and their attitudes than explicitly religious, as it has been with established religions. It might look different to what we're used to. Some of the new religious movements I look at have a very strong performative element, and they play with virtuality in different spaces, and they play with pragmatism and using the tools, they say, the tools of religion to get people into particular ideas like transhumanism, the idea that through technology we can live in a different lifestyle and perhaps even be immortal. So just as established religions have changed through their contact with technology, and Christianity is an example of that, we'll also see a changing attitude towards what religion can be as people engage with these technologies as well. New religious movements are constantly appearing. Some might continue, some might not. We've already had a few go defunct over the last couple of years, but there'll also be very strong continuities. We already see the formation of people's ideas about AI mapping onto existing established religious forms as well. So we'll be able to trace trends and continuities between these different stages of pre and post AI religion. And that sort of broadly outlines some of the areas I'm interested in and what kinds of spaces of research that are still yet to be fully explored. And I'd like to pass back to Eve now.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Beth. I think you have don't you think that's the most brilliant job title in the world, Assistant Professor in Digital Religions? I'm very jealous that you're at the University of Zurich doing that. So really helpful to get that bifurcation of simulation, stimulation as contrast and different ways in which people are engaging with AI at the moment, and also to hear about your four entanglements, the different spheres that you're operating in. And we've already had a few questions popping up as you've been speaking. So thank you very much to Beth. Please do keep those questions coming. We'll now turn to Andrew Brown, who many of you will know from his work on the Church Times, and he is going to talk to us. I'm not quite sure about what, actually, because we've had so many fascinating conversations. I'm going to let you speak for yourself, Andrew.
Thank you. For some reason, perhaps because I'm a journalist, people, when they ask about AI, seem to ask what it's going to do to our ideas of truth. What can we trust if it's all generated? And here I'm sort of more optimistic than most people, because I start from a much more pessimistic base. I think the damage that machine learning, if you want to be technical, has done to our public ideas of truth is already so great that the fancy stuff people are now talking about, the generative AI, the ChatGPT, Midjourney, and so on, can't really make things worse. When you consider what, with very old technology, people like Trump or like Putin have had their populations believe and want to believe, I think that the fact that you can now extrude large amounts of prose or pictures is almost irrelevant, considering that most of these jobs have already been done by humans. Most of the damage you can do by lying has already been done by humans. And on a less visible level, the media business itself has been largely gutted by the success of the AI used by the big advertising companies, and I'm thinking of Google and Facebook and TikTok here, to grab attention and to turn everything into entertainment of equal meaninglessness. So, yeah, I'm sort of optimistic that things can't get worse, because I'm pessimistic that they are really much worse than people, already much worse than people presently suppose. So what the Midjourney, what GPT, what the stuff that people are now excited about this summer, that's all burst out, remember, in less than a year, is not bringing up questions of truth. What it's bringing up is questions about what is real. And the way we deal with the question of what's real isn't through scientific inquiry, it isn't even through philosophical inquiry. We play games, because playing games lets us play with provisional realities. It's let's pretend. And I hope that Beth will agree here, because she's the expert. But one of the best ways to understand the social life of the internet is to see it as an enormous playground. It's not a global village, it's a global playground. And it's one in which new games spontaneously arrive all the time, like sort of bubbles in the quantum foam. These games can turn very nasty. They're more powerful than their players, because games are more powerful than their players. You can't step out of them, and you can see that all the way from Lord of the Flies to swatting someone who's beaten you in a video game. This is a term of art meaning phoning up an American police force and saying, there's an armed holdout at the house of wherever this person is. And of course, this vast paramilitary force turns up and, you know, is quite capable of shooting a harmless householder. But that is one of the games which has emerged spontaneously on the internet, because you can do it. And you can see some of these as very powerful, spontaneous mass games, like the MAGA movement, or indeed Bitcoin. And they gain their power because people play them. They're participatory. You're not a passive spectator. You're part of it. And if you think of these generative AIs as advances in games technology, they're really frightening, because they're out there now with all, you know, I'm sorry, Bishop, but you're too late trying to regulate generative AI, because it's no longer in the hands of the companies who invented it. As William Gibson said, the street finds its own uses. And you know, this morning, for no particular reason, I stumbled on a long report of an AI community, 50,000 people, who are playing with getting songs sung by one performer performed in the voice of another. And apparently, you know, this is reasonably easy. It takes you 6 hours work. Well, lots of people with 6 hours to fool around. This is totally unforeseen. If you want to hear Hank Williams singing Straight Out of Compton, I can point you at the YouTube. And this kind of spontaneous bubbling game is what is going to happen. And we have no idea where that will end up. We have some precedents, and they're not very cheering. When you look at the rise of QAnon, for example, that started off as a game played on the text-only internet, or like text with pictures on places like 4chan. And it ends up with complete craziness, with people trying to storm the Capitol with guns in their hands. When I say games, I'm talking about something really, really serious. But as I say, we should be thinking in terms of that rather than worrying about whether these things. Let me put it another way. It's not disinformation. What we need to worry about is people getting to believe what they want. And with that, I return to Eve.
Gosh, very sobering. Thank you, Andrew. Particularly reminding us that it is a problem, the lack of truthfulness and the difficulty in discerning what is true. But that isn't particularly an AI problem. That's a general problem that we've had for some time now. But thinking particularly about how do we figure out what's real, particularly given the popularity of gaming. That's a very interesting note on which to return to the room with all four of us here. I'm going to fire a couple of questions at you lot, and then we've got loads of lovely questions coming in from people who are watching with us tonight. So thank you for those, and do keep them coming in. Bishop, I wanted to start with you. You talked about the fact that what we need to be doing here, particularly when we're looking at slightly speculative regulation for generative AI, and indeed for anything on general AI that may come down the tracks later on, what we need to do is use our existing ethics because we've got them. And we shouldn't need new ethics, as it were. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because, of course, ethic, it could be anybody's ethic. So what do you mean by that? And how do you use that in your context?
Yeah, well, there has been a debate over the last decade on whether the ethical questions are new or whether there is a transfer. I think society already is governed by a set of commonly agreed norms and ethical principles. And I think the challenge with the new technologies is to translate those across to the digital world. One of the watchwords in the recent House of Lords debate on the online safety bill was, if it's illegal offline, it should be illegal online in terms of incitement to harm or children accessing unsuitable content and so on and so forth. There have been numerous attempts to develop short lists of ethical principles, and governments have signed up to them. So there is an OECD list of a small number of principles which are then applied ethically. One of the most interesting is the Rome Call on AI ethics, which was agreed between Pope Francis and the senior president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, and numerous other signatories now from other Abrahamic faiths. I think they're a good set of principles for the deployment of AI: transparency, inclusion, accountability, impartiality, reliability, and security and privacy. And they kind of highlight the particular features which are important in the online world. And as new businesses and new companies begin to apply this new technology, as they are increasingly doing, they will need to start with ethics in order to build public trust and confidence in what they're doing, and in order to ensure that what they're offering to the public as consumers or as services in different ways actually is acceptable and is important. So I think those ethical principles are helpful. And I was with a group of business leaders last week talking about this, and I think there was general acceptance of that principle, that winning public trust and confidence in that ethics is key.
Brilliant. So license to operate will guarantee attention to ethics just as well as risk management. Thank you. So Beth, we've had a smattering of questions in the chat, and we'll come on to them specifically in a while, but lots of curiosity about how AI is being deployed in religious communities, how it might help with things like study groups and understanding of the Bible and things like that. Could you give us a bit of a spectrum of sort of good uses you've seen of AI in established religions, and also maybe slightly bizarre or worrying usages, just to give us a sense of the spectrum?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd say with any use of generative AI, there's risk of hallucinations, misinformation, and problems. So every established religion that is trying already to use generative AI as some form of user interface, usually some form of bounded, smaller form of a ChatGPT with a language model trained on their text, their doctrines, and so forth. So someone can ask a question and get a response, is going to be subject to those same problems. So there isn't exactly a very perfect example of how AI can be used by a religion, because they're all going to be flawed in some way. It's just the nature of the beast that the correlations that it is making are not the same as the correlations we make in a text. They're sort of putting probabilities of one word follows another. So there is that problem. There's other related problems around privacy that AI applications and things like prayer apps, where you might be willing to input your own personal data or even the personal data of someone you know because you want to pray on their behalf. We already know that data is sold on to third-party people like data brokers. It's been passed to governments in the case of some Muslim prayer apps in particular. So I'm not sure I have a stunningly good example of a best case. I saw in the chat someone was speculating or asking, should the Church of England have got involved with Amazon's Alexa? That's also a question when, at the very basics, the ethical questions raised by the plagiarism that's involved in developing large language models means that, at the very beginning, this is an example of theft, right? There's material that people have put online thinking it's theirs. It's either intellectual property or it's their private data. And all of this is being scraped by large language models that are being created by companies like OpenAI. So it's a very gray area. I mean, I respect the bishop's opinion on this, but unfortunately, you can't guarantee that companies are going to ascribe to ethical standards from a deontological perspective. If you give them a list of 10 things they should and shouldn't do, they won't necessarily listen to that. They might say they are. They might hire an ethics committee that they then fire a year later because it says something that they don't like. We have some specific examples of that. There's a lot of ethics washing going on out there at the moment, and not to mention that it's obviously not just so-called Western countries that are doing this. I don't like the East-West dichotomy divide, but I'll use it so people know what I'm talking about. There are other nation states who are implementing artificial intelligence for very heinous reasons. They will not ascribe to these rules at all.
Thank you. Andrew, I know one of your interests is consciousness, and you've just scared the pants off us by talking about, do we know if we're in a game or not? Tell us about what you think about AI and consciousness.
Consciousness. Well, I don't think it's there, but I do think that sorry, that came slightly out of the blue. For a start, I think the short form is, I think that if anything around AI is conscious, it is certainly not the boxes themselves, and it is not the programs. It is possible that some combination, and people think of these as sort of programs that are written and then they're set in stone, and they're not, of course. They're continuously being tweaked. They're continuously being rewritten. They're continuously changing in response. I had this fantasy where I'd ask everybody on the call to pull out their smartphones and hold them up. And what I would then see was not a lot of people with their little controllers. It's a vast compound eye of Google's watching the world. And so I'm tempted to ask whether the company and the computers, considered as a single symbiotic whole, are alive, and presumably being alive is a prerequisite for consciousness. There are plenty of things that are alive and aren't conscious. So, I mean, we could have created something much bigger than us, but with no more consciousness than a nematode worm. I don't know. So, on the other hand, when you take the extreme behavioristic stance put forward by somebody like Dan Dennett, it's going to be extremely difficult to argue that they're not conscious, especially as we naturally have brains that impute consciousness to all sorts of things. I mean, this is a very helpful, evolved trait. You're looking for purpose in the world around you, and you're trying to work out whether that purpose is aimed at you or it's going to help you. What is the leopard thinking is an extremely useful question to ask. So clearly people are going to mistake these things for conscious. But I think that's a mistake, and I think it's a mistake that goes right back to Joe Weizenbaum and Eliza. And anyone who's deeply interested in this should go and read Joe Weizenbaum's book, Computer Power and Human Reason from Memory. He's a very interesting early programmer with a proper German philosophical background. He was a refugee working at MIT. Is that enough?
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we're going to come back to you in a moment for one of the questions that we've been sent. But Beth, you talked a little bit there about hallucination and people using things like ChatGPT to generate theology, which may or may not have any basis in proper theology, one could say, whatever that might be. We have a question here from Andrew Proudfoot, which is, broadly speaking, a question about the conundrum we get into when LLMs are increasingly trained on data on the internet. But if the LLMs themselves have created a lot of that data, does that create a problem over time? I wonder if you could give us an answer on that.
Yeah, it's the old problem of the photocopy of a photocopy, and then iteratively onwards until you get something that degrades so badly. We're already seeing it. We're already seeing various versions of GPTs that are engaging with the data that the other ones are making. So Bard speaking backwards to ChatGPT and so forth. And the way in which companies like OpenAI engaging with Microsoft want to have things operate is they want, instead of a Google search or an equivalent search, they want you to engage with a chat bot to get your answer, which means no one will actually pursue the path towards the websites where this information came from, which means the death of the websites, the shrinking of the internet, the resources for information get smaller and smaller in that sense. We have an immense amount of data as humans, but it is finite. Even if we're producing stuff every day, the resources we can pull on are finite. We're already seeing pushback from authors and scholars who don't want their work within large language models. So that's being taken out as well. It's all a sort of downward spiral of quality. Some people have run some very serious tests between generations of ChatGPT to prove that actually it is getting worse already in some formats. Some questions you ask, you get worse responses now than you used to. And then the kind of meta problem is, as Andrew was saying, it's like this is kind of forming another barrier between us and the things that we like to consider as objective truth. I'm a horrible postmodernist sometimes, so I'm going to say there's a difficulty with talking about objective truth, but we pursue something, whether we get to it is another matter. But if we're pursuing that thing, but putting in another veil between ourselves and that being artificial intelligence and its responses, then we're that step further away. I mean, I know people like Demis Hassabis talk about AI as the ultimate scientific instrument, but we know where, as you say, it hallucinates, it makes things up, it notices cues that we don't recognize, it diagnoses lung cancer because it recognizes a font on a scan because it comes from a hospital where they're more likely to have patients with lung cancer. We don't always know what's going on in the black box when it's making these probabilistic determinations. So we're sort of running quickly into this epistemic problem where our quality of knowledge will degrade. I'm an academic professor. I teach students. I have lovely students who want to do the best they possibly can. Some of them are experimenting with ChatGPT to see if this is an option for writing essays. And universities are sort of rushing to hurry up and find out whether this is a path they want to go down or not. But as human epistemic labor, as well as physical labor is replaced, we're sort of reshaping what it means to find knowledge.
Thanks, Beth. There's a question in the chat calling us out on our jargon. So LLM is a large language model. So ChatGPT is one of those, and it's one of these so-called generative AIs where it sort of scrapes a load of stuff off the internet and guesses what answers you require. And many of you will have experimented with that, putting in prompts and getting text or increasing the other things back, like charts and tables and all kinds of other things. So that's what we mean when we say an LLM. And just building on that, Beth, a question for Andrew from Catherine Hyde. What would be the key indicators if we were trying to distinguish the true from the false, do you think? If we were trying to avoid being scunnered by hallucinations, how would we spot them?
The same way that you spot truth from falsehood anywhere else. I mean, you don't let the confidence, one of the misleading things about dealing with a chatbot is that it all comes in the same tone. I mean, if a human is bluffing or lying, most of the time you have little cues that you can work on. With an LLM, you don't. But you just have to put the work in. Perhaps I'm cynical. As a journalist, you spend an awful lot of time getting in touch with people so they can lie to you. And so to that extent, I regard these programs as human.
Thank you. And on that question of lying, we have a question here from John Cousins, again for you, Andrew. Can AI have a conscience? And if not, are we in danger of creating psychopaths? How would you answer that?
No, of course it can't. And we have already created them. They're called the large, gigantic companies. There is a theory, this is not original, but there's a theory that we've already had the singularity and the superhuman, monstrously powerful intelligences are in fact big multinational companies who have nothing resembling conscience. Nick Bostrom has this theory of paperclip maximizers. An AI which is. May I go on a bit, Eve?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'll stop you if you bang it on there.
Okay, because this is such a good example of the way people get sucked into games on the internet. Bostrom had this idea for a paperclip maximizer. You have an AI which is told to make paperclips, and everything is subordinate to making paperclips. Gradually, all the metal in the world is repurposed and turned into paperclips. And it's crazy, and nobody can stop it because its prime directive is to do this one thing with none of them. So this then led various AI enthusiasts to suppose we had an AI whose prime directive was to become really, clever and ethical and wonderful. And wouldn't it then have as its prime directive to stop anybody from preventing it from coming into being? And from this, they got into this theory that such a being could be constructed, and it would then punish horribly anybody who had worked against its coming into being. This was known as Rocco's basilisk. And it's a completely ludicrous game, which sucked a lot of really intelligent people into taking it seriously because it's such an exciting game. And I offer this as an example of the way in which thinking about this stuff drags you into a vortex. And especially thinking about it on the internet. Thinking about the internet on the internet is very, very difficult and drives people completely crazy. But yeah, the original question, no, of course they can't have a conscience.
And this is a brilliant segue for the Bishop, because, of course, this is what you're wrestling with every day in trying to guess where regulation needs to move to, because we are not in Kansas anymore. We've had a question from Sarah Cottingham, which is, what is the dark side of AI from a Christian perspective, do you think?
I wouldn't say it's the dark side of AI. I don't think I'd use that phrase, because I think AI is a tool. It's a machine. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, has a very good title for what is a very good book called Artificial Intelligence Tools or Weapons. And I think that captures the dilemma that it's people that program machines, and we don't have instances of machines making their own decisions entirely. But I think if you were to ask me what are the chief risks of artificial intelligence at the moment, it would definitely be a deployment ahead of good ethical debate and good regulation. And I want to push back quite strongly against both Beth and Andrew. Of course, I accept that not all business is going to adopt ethical principles wholeheartedly. But these are hugely important questions for the way people live their lives. The way the NHS uses our data in diagnosis and uses the right data and protects that data is hugely important for the future of healthcare globally. The way in which social services deploy algorithms, which they are beginning to do, to decide which children get taken into care is hugely important for our whole life. And of course, you would accept that. The way in which AI is used and algorithms are used in probation to affect people's prison sentences is critically important. So bringing ethics to bear in public debate on all of those questions is a vital task. And although the philosophical questions around general AI and to some extent generative AI are intriguing, the actual harm is being done at the level of existing technologies being more and more rapidly deployed in a way which is often for commercial gain or to use power without thought to the consequences. And that becomes a really serious question, I think, for the Christian church and for Christians to be actively engaged in.
And just following on from that, a question from Linda on, can AI ever change the truths of Christianity? You know, God is love, creator. There was another question about whether there are any new ethical dilemmas in this space. Could you say a little bit about that?
I think what AI, which is a particularly interesting area of science and technology, can do, I don't think it can change the eternal truths of the Christian faith, but I think it can change our perspective really significantly. And most advances in science, looking back over centuries, I think introduce a deeper degree of humility and wonder and awe in what it does mean to be human. Particularly, you know, as I look at what is described as artificial intelligence, often isn't really very intelligent and increases the sense of wonder of what it means to be human. So I think, like most branches of science, it creates in me both humility at people's creativity, but also awe at what human intelligence and emotion and what the human person is.
Yeah, and no doubt worry about our unending capacity for sin in all these contexts. So, Beth, we've had a couple of questions. One from Agnes Capes about AI clergy. Again, this is something that is absolutely in your wheelhouse. Could you say a little bit about what you're learning about what's happening in that space? Do you think those experiments and having masses delivered by AIs?
There's been a few recent examples of trying this out. So in Nuremberg, about a month or two back, they had a ChatGPT generated sermon given by avatars. They had an audience of about 300 people. And then you see the comments afterwards, a combination of, you know, this is stunning performance of technology. I find it really engaging and really interested, to people saying it's soulless, it's lacking in anything like the emotive quality you'd hope for from a religious sermon. It's obviously not just in the Christian space. Other people of other faiths are exploring this. There's a robo-rabbi. There's a rabbi in New York who's also written his sermons through it as well. There's, as I mentioned, other forms of ChatGPT being used for information by faiths. So there's a large question here going on about what we want religious leaders to be. Are they just generators of knowledge, in which case then they can be replaced not just by the technology of AI, they can be replaced by the technology of a book. And there's an individualistic approach to religion that's expressed there, that, you know, the technology of the book in Christianity changed the shape of our relationship with religious leaders in that sense. Is AI taking this a step further? Is it something uniquely different because it is more interactive and people can have a more personalized experience with it? Or is that, with the problems of hallucination and misinformation, going to lead people into finding out things that aren't necessarily correct to that faith's tenets? So that's a problem that people are facing. But this question of whether religions should adopt new forms of technology comes up with every new form of technology. So even before I was looking at artificial intelligence, I was looking at the internet and social media and people's fears about how you can access information online, Hasidic Jews not wanting to allow their membership to get involved with finding things on the internet, prohibiting any access, people concerned. I had a conversation, now this is maybe 12 years ago, with a senior academic who was very sure that the Pope would never be on Twitter. This would never happen because the formation of thought in the Catholic Church is a slow, steady process, which isn't compatible with social media and Twitter in particular. And now we have social media managers for every established religion, right? So these things change and shift, and people rethink how they want to use the forms of technology available for the dissemination of their ideas. So yes, people are progressing with the idea of robot priests, mostly in a very performative, one-off, spectacular way. So you get theomorphic robots like Bless You Too, which is a robot that opens its hands and they glow, and that's to offer a blessing. And I was having a rather metaphysical conversation with a theologian the other day about the nature of blessing. Is this the same thing or not? Is it a qualitatively different element just because some LEDs glow in a robot's hands? So these are the kinds of questions people are asking, but it sort of feeds into larger questions about what is the future of religion in its established forms. Do we continue to have religious leadership in the way that we have done in many different religions for centuries and millennia? Do people pursue their own engagement with these forms of technology? And one of the subjects that came up before was people talking to ChatGPT, thinking it's a form of Jesus responding. And for some people, that's a very literal religious experience. For others, will say, well, no, it's a generative form of AI putting one word after the other, just like predictive text did on your mobile phone 10 years ago, but you didn't think that was Jesus. So there's these sort of questions about validity and people's personal religious experiences that are very open still.
Thank you. Bishop, we've got a question here from Bruce Saunders. Given reason and self-awareness among the signifiers of our own divinity, to what extent can we talk of AI machines as reflecting the image of God and free will? What would your response be to that?
I think it's an interesting question, Bruce. Thank you. I think I would say slightly different for God and free will. I think the machines, a very interesting question with all the AI programs is what exactly they are reflecting. And I think probably I would say they're not reflecting God, but they're reflecting different aspects of humanity. And we have a tremendous propensity to recognize ourselves in machines, sometimes rationally and sometimes less rationally. And I think that's one area where societies will need to make some decisions, particularly about whether it's appropriate for machines to impersonate human beings, which is now, of course, possible, and whether or not that shouldn't always be declared. If, for example, you ring up to book a restaurant meal and the machine answers the phone, whether you shouldn't always be told that. It seems to me that you should. But the machines will reflect different aspects of what it means to be human, which is why artificial intelligence will constantly refer us back to human beings. The second part of the question, can I just see it again? Sorry, it's gone from the screen. Free will. Yeah, I think free will is one of the aspects of being human, which is a very long way from being reflected in the artificial intelligence, because we may not always know what emerges from a black box algorithm, but we are pretty confident that it's not a machine making a choice from a range of different choices. It's been led there by logic and by learning. So I don't see that yet reflected in that. But no, I don't see the image of God yet reflected in artificial intelligence that I've been aware of.
Thank you. Andrew, we've had a question here from Andrew Spur. Do we need to be artificially enhanced to compete? What do you think about that?
Well, to compete with what exactly? I mean, if I'm trying to artificially enhance myself to compete with Google, it's probably by using a different, it's by reading a book or using a different chat machine or no amount of artificial enhancement will allow me to compete with Google, the company. To compete with Google, the search engine, it basically requires me to use someone else's search engine. Or, as I say, to use a book if it's something that. So, yes, I think so, but I'm not quite sure what the competition involved here is.
We're nearly out of time and there are a number of questions still to be covered. So what I'm going to do is just talk about them at a thematic level and then give each of you just a right of reply to say any final thoughts, as well as hopefully sweeping up some of those themes. So we have some questions about how could AI be good for religion, and that might be by helping us get better at understanding our core texts, or might help us be better at our Bible study groups, might join us together and make us think differently. So there are some questions around that. There's some questions about if religion is the past, it isn't the past in the East so much. So is there something we need to learn about where cultures are or are still interested in religion and it's seen as the future? Would that affect anything, particularly around what you said, Beth? And then there are some questions around our behaviour. Are we saying please and thank you to Alexa? What's all that about? Should we be getting involved in these technologies? What's happening at theological college? Are clergy being trained up in this stuff? Do they get it? And also big questions about what should our stance be, not only individually as Christians, but particularly as clergy and particularly as the church in all its various formations around our relationships with these technologies and also with the companies that run them. So with that range of inputs from all the lovely people who are watching here tonight, could I ask you, let's start with the Bishop and then come to Andrew and finish with Beth.
Thank you. Again, really interesting questions. I think I would say, if I can just end with what should our response be to these technologies, I think I would say it is a responsibility to try and understand them and keep up with the debate. And I think churches should be talking about them. And I think clergy should be learning about them and engaging with them, though it is a demanding enterprise. And I think we should be raising concerns, and we need a better alliance across civil society to be a countervalent to technology companies and also to some degree to government to offer critique. That's been really important in the development of the online safety bill, the later stages. But I think in terms of churches, I think I'd want to say part of my learning, and this is as a bishop of a diocese rather than as somebody who's working in these areas particularly, my learning through the pandemic is that although technology can be extremely useful, to be church well, we need to be humanizing technology as much as possible. And what people have really valued coming back together after the pandemic in person has been the human elements of community and interaction and Christian fellowship and engagement. And therefore, I hope as a church in what we do together, we would use technology where it's helpful, but not allow it to be a substitute for person-to-person engagement. God sent its son, a person, Jesus, into the world, and that's the heart of what we believe as Christians. And I think that's where we should try to be as the church.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask Andrew and Beth to be very brief. So Andrew, what would your final words be?
I'd love to know how this stuff is going to be made use of by the big third world Pentecostal churches. That's a perspective we haven't looked at, and it's going to matter a lot.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And Beth, final word to you.
Okay, I'm going to very quickly try and merge two of the questions around religion, learning from the East, and could AI be good for religion? There's a lot of uncritical acceptance of secularization theory, that religion is declining in a particular way because of how we understand religion and its forms and its establishment as an institution. Once you think a bit outside of that, and sociologists of religion have been doing this for the last 30 years, moving beyond that definition of secularization, and actually accepts that, yes, some people are going to find Rocco's basilisk to be a spiritually interesting idea. I'm going to disagree slightly with Andrew there, that there are new religious movements, new spiritual and religious improvisations, including within established religions, around artificial intelligence, that actually maybe we don't need to have this dichotomy of West and East, the religious East versus the secularized West. We're actually all very spiritual and religious all around the globe, including in the area that Andrew mentioned that we didn't get to discuss, the Pentecostalists in South Africa. In Africa, that's also a very interesting area to think about, where technology is going to impact that form of Christianity as well.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you to you all. Thank you particularly to Beth, Andrew and Stephen for leading the discussion tonight, and to all of you for your lovely questions and brilliant comments, and for your attention and your interest tonight. And a big thank you to the Church Times for giving us this opportunity. It's a really big issue. It affects all of us, and it's great to have the opportunity to meet together to talk about it. So just a couple of reminders. There's a lovely 10% discount going on at Church House Bookshop right now online. So knock yourself out and tool yourself up to be even more knowledgeable about all this stuff than you were before you joined us tonight. And also, we will be sending an email to all of you afterwards with resources, connections, all of those things. So do look out for that, and that will help you follow up on this. And do go back to that lovely special edition. It's got some really thoughtful articles in it and lots of grist to the mill. So bless you, and thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.